The first thing she said to me wasn't hello. It was, eyes are up here. I didn't even realize I'd been staring until the words landed like a splash of cold water. I looked up fast, embarrassed, and before my brain could filter anything, I blurted, "You wore that bikini on purpose." For a split second, I thought I'd ruined everything. Then she laughed, an unexpected, full laugh that cut through the sound of the waves, and said, "Wow. You're either very brave or very stupid." That was how I met my neighbor on a beach 300 miles away from home, and that single moment would quietly change the direction of my life. I hadn't planned to be there. The beach trip was a last-minute escape after a year that felt like it had wrung me dry. A divorce finalized with cold signatures, a job that paid the bills but stole my sleep, and an apartment where silence echoed louder than arguments ever did. I drove overnight, pulled into a small coastal town just after sunrise, and rented the cheapest room I could find. I told myself I just needed salt air and anonymity. No neighbors. No history. No expectations. That illusion lasted exactly 10 minutes. She was standing near the shoreline, arguing with a beach umbrella that refused to stay planted. Wind whipped her hair across her face, and she was laughing at herself, not caring who watched. I recognized her laugh before I recognized her face. Because I'd heard it through walls, late-night phone calls, bursts of joy, sometimes quiet tears, coming from the apartment next to mine back home. We'd shared hallways, elevators, polite nods. Never names. Never conversations. Just proximity. Seeing her there felt unreal, like spotting a familiar character in a completely different movie. After our awkward first exchange, we walked along the water, shoes in hand. She introduced herself, Maya, and raised an eyebrow when I said my name. "So you do exist," she said. "I thought you were a ghost who only comes out to take the trash at midnight." I told her I could say the same. We laughed, and the laughter came easy, like it had been waiting for permission. She told me she'd come to the beach after burning out at work, after ending something that had been wrong for too long. I told her I was learning how to be alone without feeling lonely. Neither of us said everything, but we said enough. Hours passed without us noticing. We talked about childhood summers, the weird comfort of routine, the fear of starting over. She teased me about my terrible timing and I teased her about her war with the umbrella. When the sun began to dip, she looked at me seriously and said, "You know, first impressions matter." I apologized again. She waved it off. "I liked your honesty," she said. Clumsy, but honest. That night, back in my room, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the way she'd looked at me when she laughed, the way she listened like my words mattered. I reminded myself it was just a beach conversation. Temporary. Fleeting. But something in my chest disagreed. The next morning, I almost didn't go back to the beach. I told myself not to expect anything. Expectations had burned me before. Still, my feet carried me there, and there she was again, sitting on a towel, reading, sunglasses perched on her nose like she wasn't hoping I'd show up too. "Eyes up here," she said again when she felt me nearby, a smile playing on her lips. "Noted," I said. Forever. We spent the day together again, and this time the conversations went deeper. She talked about feeling invisible in her last relationship, about shrinking herself to keep the peace. I told her about learning how to apologize for things that weren't my fault. Somewhere between confessions and jokes, a quiet connection formed, not rushed, not loud, just steady. But real life has a way of knocking on even the softest moments. On the third day, I saw her sitting alone, shoulders tight, phone clenched in her hand. Her smile didn't reach her eyes when she saw me. She told me her mother was sick, that she might need to leave early. I listened. I didn't try to fix it. I just stayed. When she finally broke down, crying into the wind, I didn't touch her until she reached for me first. That night, she asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you believe people meet for a reason?" I hesitated. "I think they meet," I said. "What they do with it is the reason." The next morning, she was gone. No note. No text. Just an empty stretch of sand where she'd been. I told myself not to be dramatic, not to assign meaning where there might be none. Still, the rest of the trip felt hollow. I drove home early, the ocean fading in my rearview mirror. Back in my apartment building, life resumed its gray rhythm. Days passed. Weeks. I wondered if the beach version of us was something that only existed under open skies and warm light. I told myself to let it go. Then one evening, as I unlocked my door, I heard laughter through the wall. Her laughter. There was a knock a moment later. When I opened the door, she stood there in jeans and a soft sweater, hair pulled back, no bikini, no beach, just real life. "Hi, neighbor," she said. "Eyes are up here." I laughed, relief and something deeper flooding through me. She told me her mother was recovering. She told me she'd thought about the beach every day. She told me she'd hoped I was more than a vacation version of myself. We didn't rush into anything. We took walks. We cooked dinner. We talked about fears instead of pretending they didn't exist. There were misunderstandings, moments where old habits surfaced, times when it would have been easier to walk away. But we stayed. We chose to look up, really look at each other, when it mattered. Months later, standing on that same beach again, she squeezed my hand and said, "You know, I'm glad you looked." I smiled. "I'm glad you made me look up." Some connections begin with attraction. The ones that last begin with attention. And sometimes, the moment you think you've said the wrong thing is the moment your real story starts. The problem with real life is that it doesn't pause just because something beautiful has started. The morning after she knocked on my door, reality crept back in quietly, like it always does. Alarms rang. Emails piled up. Responsibilities waited patiently, ready to reclaim their space. And yet, something had shifted. When I poured my coffee, I found myself smiling for no reason. When I stepped into the hallway, I half expected to see her door open again, Maya leaning out with that familiar look that said she was about to say something clever. We started slow, almost cautiously, as if both of us were afraid to break whatever fragile thing had followed us home from the beach. We met in shared spaces first, the elevator, the laundry room, the small cafe on the corner where neither of us had ever bothered to stop before. Conversation stretched longer each time. We talked about small things at first, bad movies we secretly loved, childhood dreams that didn't quite survive adulthood, how strange it was to live next to someone for years without really knowing them. Beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding that we were both carrying old bruises. One evening, sitting on my couch with takeout containers between us, she grew quiet. The light from the TV flickered across her face, and I could tell something heavier was coming. She told me about the relationship she'd left, the slow erosion of confidence, the way compliments turned into control, how she'd started dressing for approval instead of joy. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. I realized then that her joke on the beach hadn't just been playful. It had been a boundary. A line she'd learned to draw the hard way. I told her about my marriage. How love can fade not with a bang, but with exhaustion. How two people can become polite strangers sharing the same space. How silence can hurt more than shouting. Saying it out loud felt like releasing a breath I'd been holding for years. She listened the way she always did, fully, without interruption, without trying to rewrite my story. The challenges didn't announce themselves dramatically. They showed up in small moments. When I pulled away during an argument instead of talking. When she braced herself for criticism that never came. When we both misread each other's silence as disinterest instead of fear. There were nights when doubt sat between us like an uninvited guest, reminding us of everything that could go wrong. One night, after a misunderstanding that spiraled into distance, she stood at my door again, but this time her eyes were uncertain. "I don't want to run," she said softly. "But I don't know how to stay without losing myself." I swallowed and told her the truth. "I don't want to disappear when things get hard. But I'm learning how not to." That was the turning point. Not a grand confession. Not a dramatic promise. Just two people choosing honesty over comfort. We learned each other's rhythms. Learned when to give space and when to step closer. Learned that attraction fades if it isn't supported by respect, and that respect deepens when you're willing to really see someone, flaws, fears, and all. The beach became our quiet symbol. Not because of the bikini or the joke, but because that was where we first noticed each other fully. Months later, standing barefoot in the sand again, the wind tugging at our clothes, she looked at me and said, "You know what I learned?" "What?" "That being seen doesn't mean being judged. It means being chosen." I looked at her, really looked, and realized the most important moments in life aren't the ones where someone catches your eye. They're the ones where someone holds your gaze and doesn't look away. Life has a strange sense of humor. Just when you start to believe you've figured out how to hold something gently, it tests whether you're gripping too tight or not enough. After that second trip to the beach, things between Maya and me felt steady, real in a way that didn't need constant reassurance. But real doesn't mean easy. The first real test came quietly. She got an offer from her company to transfer to another city. A promotion. Better pay. A chance she'd worked toward for years. She told me one evening as we sat on the floor of her living room, backs against the couch, the windows open to the city noise outside. She tried to sound excited, but I could hear the hesitation underneath. "I haven't said yes," she said. "I haven't said no either." I nodded, pretending my chest wasn't tightening. Old instincts whispered that this was how things ended. Opportunities pulling people apart. Distance doing what arguments couldn't. I wanted to tell her I needed her to stay. Instead, I asked, "What do you want?" She stared at the wall for a long time. "I want to stop choosing safety over honesty," she said. "But I also don't want to lose myself again." Her words echoed something deep in me. I realized then that love wasn't about convincing someone to stay, it was about creating a space where staying felt like a choice, not a sacrifice. Still, fear has a way of speaking louder than wisdom. Over the next few weeks, tension slipped into our days. Not sharp or cruel, just heavy. Conversations paused where they shouldn't. Texts took longer to answer. We were both trying to be strong, and in doing so, we were growing quiet. One night, after a small disagreement that wasn't really about dishes or schedules, she said, "You're pulling away." "I'm trying not to," I replied, frustrated. "I just don't know how to stand here without bracing for goodbye." That was when she finally said it out loud. "I'm scared too." The honesty cracked something open. We talked until the sun came up, about the versions of ourselves we used to be, the ones who stayed silent to keep peace, who mistook endurance for love. She admitted she was afraid success would cost her connection. I admitted I was afraid connection would cost me stability. We weren't arguing anymore. We were finally standing on the same side of the fear. The decision didn't come immediately. But clarity did. She turned down the transfer, not because of me, but because she realized she didn't want to keep running toward the next thing without checking what she was leaving behind. I didn't ask her to stay. That mattered to both of us. Instead, we made a promise, not about forever, but about presence. About choosing to show up honestly, even when it was uncomfortable. Time did what time does. It softened our edges. We built routines that felt like home. Sunday mornings with coffee and no plans, late-night walks when the world felt too loud, quiet moments where words weren't necessary. We learned how to argue without hurting, how to apologize without defensiveness, how to laugh even when things felt uncertain. One evening, months later, we stood on the balcony watching the city lights flicker on. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "You know what still makes me smile?" "What?" "That the first thing you ever did was look, and the first thing you learned was how to really see." I smiled because she was right. Attraction had started the story, but attention had written the rest. We weren't perfect. We didn't pretend to be. But we were present, and that changed everything. Some love stories begin loudly. Others begin with a joke, a boundary, a moment of awkward honesty on a windy beach. And if you're brave enough to look up, past the surface, past the fear, you might find someone who meets your gaze and says, without words, "I'm here. Let's stay." There's a moment in every real story where you realize love isn't about what you feel anymore, it's about what you're willing to do. Not the dramatic gestures people post about, but the quiet decisions no one sees. Chapter 4 of our story didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with responsibility. Maya's mother's health took a sudden turn that winter. Hospital rooms replaced weekend plans. Phone calls interrupted dinners. I watched Maya try to be strong the way she always had, smiling for nurses, reassuring family, carrying everyone else's fear like it was her job. One night, in the sterile glow of the hospital hallway, she finally leaned into me and whispered, "I'm tired of being the strong one." So I stepped in where I could. I drove her to appointments. Learned how she took her coffee when she hadn't slept. Sat quietly when words would have been useless. I didn't try to fix what I couldn't. I just stayed. And in staying, I learned something important. Love isn't proven by grand declarations, it's proven by consistency. But even that closeness came with friction. Stress has a way of exposing old wounds. There were days when she snapped and immediately apologized, afraid she'd pushed too far. There were nights when I felt invisible, like my support didn't quite land. Once, after a long day, I said something careless about needing a break. The look on her face told me I'd touched a fear she hadn't named yet, that being loved meant being abandoned when things got heavy. We talked that night. Not defensively. Honestly. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, but I also needed space sometimes to recharge, not to escape. She told me she was afraid that needing help made her weak. We met in the middle, redefining strength as letting someone share the weight. When her mother finally stabilized, something softened between us. The crisis passed, but what remained was trust. Not blind trust, the earned kind. The kind built when someone sees you at your most exhausted and chooses you anyway. Spring came quietly. One evening, back on the same beach where everything had begun, we walked barefoot along the shore. The air was cooler this time, the crowd thinner. She stopped suddenly, turned to me, and smiled with that familiar spark. "Eyes are up here," she said again, teasing. I met her gaze and didn't look away. "They always have been." She laughed, then grew serious. "I used to think being seen was dangerous," she said. "Now I think it's the safest thing I've ever done." I took her hand, understanding finally what the beach had given us, not a fantasy, not an escape, but a beginning rooted in honesty. Love didn't save us from pain. It taught us how to face it together. And that's the part people don't always tell you. The best relationships don't distract you from life. They stand with you in it. They remind you to look up, to pay attention, to choose presence over fear. Sometimes, all it takes to change everything is a moment of awkward honesty, a joke that becomes a boundary, and the courage to really see the person standing in front of you, and to let them see you back. The funny thing about forever is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with certainty or guarantees. It shows up disguised as another ordinary day, and you only recognize it later, looking back at how naturally someone became part of your life. By the time summer returned, Maya and I had stopped wondering what we were. We weren't chasing labels anymore. We were sharing calendars, grocery lists, quiet mornings. Her shoes appeared by my door without explanation. My coffee mug somehow ended up in her sink. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, and that scared me more than chaos ever had. One evening, while we were cooking dinner, the power went out. The apartment fell into sudden darkness, city sounds filtering in through the open window. She laughed and lit a few candles, their glow dancing across the walls. We sat on the floor, eating half-cooked pasta and talking about nothing important. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Do you ever worry that peace is temporary?" I thought about it before answering. "I used to," I said. "Now I think peace is something you practice. Like trust." She reached for my hand, squeezing it softly. "I don't want a love that feels like a warning sign," she said. "I want one that feels like home." That was when I understood what she meant to me. Not excitement. Not escape. Home. The real test came a few weeks later. An argument, not explosive, but sharp enough to hurt. Old habits crept in. I went quiet. She grew defensive. Hours passed with silence pressing in. At midnight, she knocked on my door, eyes tired but steady. "We promised not to disappear," she said. So we didn't. We talked through everything, misunderstandings, fears, expectations we hadn't voiced yet. It wasn't easy. But when she rested her head against my chest afterward, I felt something settle. A sense of choosing each other again, not because it was comfortable, but because it was right. Months later, back on the beach one last time before winter, the wind tugged at her hair as she stood facing the ocean. She turned to me with a smile that held every version of us, the awkward first meeting, the late-night talks, the hospital hallways, the quiet mornings. "You know," she said, "if you'd apologized instead of making that joke, we might never be here." I laughed. "So I should thank my terrible timing?" She nodded. "For being honest. Even when it was clumsy." I looked at her, really looked, and realized the lesson life had been trying to teach me all along. Attraction catches your eye. Attention holds it. But intention, showing up, staying present, choosing respect, that's what builds a future. As the sun dipped into the water, I took her hand, feeling the steady warmth of something real. The world didn't pause. Problems would come again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Because love isn't about where your eyes go first. It's about where your heart chooses to stay.